10 mind-blowing expert knitting tips you need to know. Hi everyone, Norman here. Today's video is all about knitting tips, but not just any knitting tips. I'm going to share really thought-provoking technical tricks that might even change the way you look at your knitting forever. And you know, not just tips like using a stitch marker to keep your stitches from falling off your circular needles, or using a little pin to attach the tail to your project so it doesn't get in the way, or knitting an SSK through the back loop in the next row so you get nice and neat decrease lines. That's all nice to know, and I have enough videos full of such tips here on this channel. No, today I want to talk about truly game-changing technical expert knitting tips that took me over a year to compile. Tips you might not even have known that you were missing them all these years. Let's show you what I mean. One question I receive very frequently is about matching edges. You love the way your binder looks, but which cast-on should you pick that looks exactly the same? Well, here's the bad news. It's impossible because a cast-on is structurally completely different. I mean, except you do a tubular cast-on and binder, but these are, well, these could better be described as grafting techniques anyway. So how do you achieve matching edges like this one anyway? So here's the trick. Start with a provisional cast-on. Step 2. Knit across your provisional cast-on for as many rows as you would like. You only need to pay attention that you leave a tail that is long enough for binding off later on. Once your project reached the desired length, bind off any way you like. Can be a standard bind off, but could also be a nice landing bind off or whatever. Just pick the bind off of your choice. It doesn't matter. When you reach the last stitch, make sure to slip it back to your knitting needle and lift this leg here one row below. So this stitch here, this stitch, can you see this stitch? Back to your knitting needle and knit it together before you pass over. This will help you to prevent a visible ear here at the end and will let your binder look much neater. See how nice and square this edge is, and then you need to pick up the stitches from your provisional cast-on. And then you can bind off any way you like. You will notice that I am here on the wrong side. So either you start your project on the wrong side so this doesn't happen, or I mean you can just also use a standard bind off here on the wrong side and purl all stitches. It's going to be the exact same thing. And there you go, 2 totally matching bind off edges. If you want to be super smart about it, use a Turkish cast-on to start your project. So I have 2 separate circular knitting needles here. One is one size smaller. That's the one I'm not going to knit with. And then again, I leave a tail that is long enough to bind off later on. And then I just wrap my yarn here around both knitting needles. That is the Turkish cast-on, the easiest cast-on on this planet. Each wrap is 1 stitch, and once I cast on the required number of stitches, I turn my work around. I pull out the bottom needle here, I pull out the bottom needle, and then I will ignore this bottom needle and pick up, where is it? Here, sorry. And then I will pick up the other end of this needle and just knit across. And this will transfer all my provisional cast-on stitches here to this cable, and later on I can just pick up the other circular needle and knit across. And then once your project reached the desired length, you bind off these stitches, and then you slide these stitches here on the bottom needle back to the knitting needle, turn your project around and bind off these stitches as well. Of course, if you are working on a very big project, there is no need to keep these needles attached. Just use some cable stoppers, so it's going to be a little bit more manageable. Here is another trick when it comes to cast-ons. I'm sure you know the e-cast-on or single cast-on or thumb method, then probably the long tail cast-on and maybe even the German twisted cast-on. But did you know that you can actually cast on purlwise and mix cast-on? So here, this is the all familiar long tail cast-on. I'm sure it doesn't need an introduction. But if you go around the yarn wrapped around your index finger here from behind and pick up the yarn here from below, you will create or cast on a purl stitch again. So you go in from behind, pick up from below, and this casts on a purl stitch. And then if you cast on 2 regular stitches and always alternate between these ways to cast on, you create the perfect basis, so in this case for a 2x2 ribbing. So always 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. You can take this concept even further. So you could start with 2 German twisted stitches, followed by 2 purlwise, 2 purlwise, 2 German twisted stitches, followed by 2 stitches purlwise. Now, why would you do that? Well, one creates twisted stitches in the same breath and the other normal stitches. So for example, I've knitted these gloves here with this beautiful pink lace weight yarn. And I was looking for a wonderful little edge for a 2x2 rib stitch, but my problem was that this edge here is inverted. So I didn't want this to look nice, I wanted this side to look nice. And that's why I started with alternating a German twisted cast on with a long tail cast on purlwise to create this edge. Some people prefer the tubular cast on. I really don't like it, so that's why I picked this option here. You could also combine a standard knitted cast on, so just do a couple of stitches using the knitted cast on and then mix in some cable cast on stitches. Just like that. So do 2 stitches with a cable cast on, followed by 2 cast on stitches with a knitted cast on. You can also do a standard e-cast on and then followed by, well, most people will call this a reverse backward loops, but it's just creating loops that are twisted in the other direction. So you could always do 2 like this and 2 like this. There are just so many possibilities to create structurally different edges. Do you know what I personally find almost infuriating? So almost every intermediate knitter knows that knit 2 together is a right leaning decrease and doesn't form such a nice and neat ridge here when used on this side, and SK slip slip knit is exactly the other way around. So it's a left leaning decrease, forms a nice little ridge here on this side and not on this side. And with make one left, which is left leaning, it's the exact opposite. So it forms a nice little line here on this side, whereas make one right will form a nice line here on this side. However, before most knitters learn make one right and make one left, they learn KFB, knit front and back, which looks neatest here on this side. It is left leaning, but then nobody ever revisits that increase and shows them the right leaning counterpart here for this side, and then their little shawls or toe up socks look a little bit lopsided with the wrong increases, well, wrong on this side. Okay, so this is KFB. Knit into the front loop of the stitch and then into the back loop of the same stitch. And if you want to mirror that, you need to knit SKL. Slip, slip back, knit, and then here below you need to lift that loop here back to the knitting needle and knit it through the back loop. That's SKL. So one more time. This is knit front and back, and here comes SKL. Slip, knit, and here lift this loop back to the knitting needle and knit it through the back loop. So as you can see, the result are nice and neat symmetrical bar increases here on both sides, whereas if you increase with KFB on both sides, you get one bar or one line of bar that is to the left of your actual increase, so it's offset, and I think this is a little bit prettier. Now, is SKL easy for beginners? No, I understand why people often start with just KFB, but there is no reason to not revisit it later on. After a year of knitting, you can handle this stitch, and you might start to care about these fine details, but hardly anyone talks about it. And this here is just the tip of the iceberg. Here's another example. So I'm sure you know how to knit SSK, slip, slip, knit. So you slip 2 stitches knitwise and then you knit them through the back loop. A very simple left leaning decrease. However, it often looks a little bit sloppy because this loop here ends up looking it is a little bit too big. So why is that? So whenever you knit a stitch, what's happening is as you stretch out this loop, it's stealing back yarn from this loop here below. So watch this loop here. As I knit this stitch here, I am closing this stitch. But back to our SSK. So the offending loop is typically this one here. So it's 2 stitches removed. So if I pull on this loop here, as I naturally do as I continue knitting, I cannot affect this loop anymore, and that's why your SSKs often look sloppy. As an alternative, you can knit SSP on the wrong side, so it works exactly the same. You slip 2 stitches knitwise, slip them back to the left needle, and then you purl them through the back loop. Now what's different here? So you create the exact same decrease. However, because of the different knitting direction, as you purl this next stitch, you will actually close the offending loose little left leaning leg. Let's turn around to show you the result. Okay, so this is SSK. I mean, not totally bad, but you can definitely spot it, and the legs are a little bit elongated. Whereas this here is SSP, a lot tighter and a lot neater. So let me show you why and how this works one more time. So here on the wrong side. So all you do is, instead of decreasing on the right side, you decrease on the wrong side. Obviously, this just works whenever you are knitting flat. So you slip 2 stitches knitwise, slip these back to your knitting needle, and then you purl them together through the back loop. That's your SSP. SSP. So let me turn this around to the other side. So here we have our SSP. So now as I knit this next stitch, I am bound to pull yarn here from this stitch, and this is what's happening here. As I knit this stitch here, this loop here gets smaller, and that's why SSP typically looks neater than SSK, and it simply has to do with the knitting direction, because here on the wrong side the left leaning stitch is actually the adjacent stitch, while on the right side, if you knit SSK, it's 2 stitches removed. Here's another thing I want you to challenge. I want you to challenge the way you think of a bind off. So this bind off is the first thing most knitters will learn. Just knit 1 stitch and pass over. But what are you actually doing here? I'm going to tell you what you are doing here. You are knitting an SSK. So I could also bind off like this. Slip 2 stitches knitwise and knit them through the back loop. Slip this stitch here back and then slip 2 stitches knitwise and knit them through the back loop. See, it's going to create the exact same edge. So why does this matter? So once you understand that a bind off is nothing else but decreases stacked upon each other, you can bind off using any other decrease as well. So here over on this side, the side where you traditionally never bind off, I want you to slip 2 stitches back to the knitting needle and knit them together. Then slip 2 stitches back to the knitting needle and knit them together. Slip 2 stitches back to the knitting needle and knit them together. Slip 2 stitches back to the knitting needle and knit them together. Easy as that. And see, you can bind off in this direction using knit 2 together as well. You don't even have to knit across to bind off. So you can also bind off using a crochet hook. So I'm just going to crochet a simple chain stitch here. So just a simple chain stitch to bind off. See what I'm doing here? Just that simple. Then slip this stitch here back to the knitting needle, and then you can pick up your work, turn around and start knitting here in the other direction until you hit your bind off. Turn around and continue knitting. Once you understand this principle, you can really get creative. There's just one problem here. Even if you bind off with knit 2 together on this side, the way I showed you before, you are still adding 1 more row. So this side here is 1 row below this side. How can you avoid this? Well, you can definitely bind off in a way that both sides are on the same level, but you need to employ a little trick. Okay, here's the trick. So I already bound off all stitches here on this side, and I'm 6 stitches here before the end of the row. And now I want you to form a little loop here with your working yarn. Like this. The loop just needs to be a lot bigger because we need to bind off with it. And then you just pick up the working yarn again. So basically you are trapping the little loop here in between your working yarn and your knitting needle. And then you knit 1 stitch. And now you pick up your loop here, your loop, and you twist it around once. Twist it around once. So basically you are trapping the loop 1 more time. Then you knit 1 stitch and then you do the exact same thing 1 more time. You trap the little loop here in between your working yarn and your needle. Knit one stitch and do the exact same thing one last little time. And knit the last stitch. So now you can turn your work around. And if you pull on your working yarn, you can close the loop. Your working yarn is already in the perfect position to continue knitting in this direction, but you still need to bind off these stitches. In comes the little trick with the crochet hook I showed you before, but you can also do it with your knitting needle. Slip 2 stitches and pass these over. Slip 1 stitch, pass over, slip 1 stitch, pass over until you hit your working yarn, and then you can pick that up, purl 1 stitch, oops, splitting the yarn, pass over and continue knitting according to your pattern. And see, now both sides are on the exact same level. You end up with, well, little floats, I guess, here on this side, but it's barely noticeable. Before I go on with more tips, a quick reminder. This video took me over a year to compile. You might have noticed that I'm not just repeating knitting tips a quick search on Google will spit out. And I pride myself in saying that almost all my other videos here on my channel go beyond what even most paid knitting courses offer. So what I'm trying to say is, this here is a full-time job for me without necessarily a full-time income. So if you value my work, consider supporting me on Patreon. Even a small amount helps, and you can cancel anytime, no questions asked. Help me helping you. You'll find the link in the description below. In knitting, creating an eyelet is super easy. You pair at the crease, so knit 2 together with a yarn over, and then you just continue knitting, and this will create a lovely little eyelet. Most people will agree that if you want to achieve the exact same thing here on the other side, you do the yarn over first and then you place the increase. However, if you take a look at this little swatch, you will soon notice that the 2 sides aren't symmetrical. Here you get this beautiful, nice little ridge. On this side, there is no ridge. So in fact, knitting eyelets isn't all that simple. In fact, I would go as far as saying that knitting eyelets is a form of art in and by itself. Let me show you what I mean. Now it's fairly easy to create a ridge on the other side as well. So here on this side, you lead with a knit 2 together and then you do your yarn over. And over on the other side, on this side, you do a yarn over, but follow up with an SSK. So here on this side, you add a left leaning decrease because you also want a ridge, and then this will be the result. In this case, the ridge is here on the outside. But what if you wanted to have this little ridge here on the inside? Of course, you could also do it the other way around. So you could lead with the yarn over and then knit 2 together. And on the other side, you do it the exact opposite way. So you lead with an SSK followed by your yarn over. But if you take a look at the results, you will soon notice that the increases are here on the inside, but they don't form a nice little ridge. So, I mean, this is pretty enough, but it doesn't have this, well, beautiful, cohesive, lace-like structure. Even if you don't change the relative position of these yarn overs and decreases, you will never get a neat and nice decrease line. I mean, this can be pretty, but you won't get decrease line. So here, I always knitted one yarn over, knit two yarn over, and then the decrease. And the same here on the other side. And in every row, the same thing. So only here the middle portion gets bigger. But see, you don't get nice and neat decrease lines. However, if I do the same thing with where I lead with the decrease and then place the yarn over, you get a much neater and crisper design, in my opinion. Just compare the two. This is sort of, well, you go like, well, what is it? And here you think, well, this could be a nice shawl in the making. However, if you take a closer look yet at this little pattern, you might notice that the yarn overs here on this side are bigger than they are here on the other side. And that's because you partially close the yarn over as you decrease. So how can you fix that? So to fix that, you will need to employ another little trick. So here over on this side, everything stays the same. You do your knit two together followed by a yarn over, you know, simple as that. You need to switch things up over here on the other side. So instead of knitting a yarn over, I want you to knit a backward loop increase. Knit a backward loop increase and then do your SSK. And then here in the next round, two little things you may consider. So first of all, I always purl my SSKs through the back loop. I feel this creates neater decrease lines. And then here, this backward loop increase, you just unravel it and purl it. And the backward loop increase does two things. First of all, it does need a little bit more yarn. And secondly, it kind of blocks the SSK from stealing any yarn. So over on this side, we can admire the results. So as you can see, the eyelets are exactly the same size on both sides, and the result is a nice and even decrease line here on this side and on this side. So I would say this is perfectly symmetrical. Here, just by comparison, this was the little swatch we started with. Now, I could go on and on with little lace tips like this one for probably another hour or so. So please comment below if you would be interested in hearing more about lace knitting tips and all these super fine little details that matter. Okay, you probably know that you can use a knitted cast-on to cast on in the middle of a project here on the right side. Just use a knitted cast on. A cable cast on works as well. And you can add additional stitches here on the right side of your project. Over here on the left side, you can do the exact same using an cast on, backward loop cast on, however you want to call it, and simply add additional loops here to your knitting needle. The backward loop cast on can be a little bit more on the wonky side. So what you can also do is you can turn your work around and then use a knitted cast on, but purl wise, to cast on these additional stitches. So it's the same principle. You just purl stitches and then you continue knitting. Of course, the opposite is true as well here on this side. You don't need to use the knitted cast-on or the cable cast-on for this side. You can also turn your work around and then simply use the cast-on to cast on additional stitches here. Then you turn around and knit across. In one of my previous tutorials where I showed you how to knit a reinforced buttonhole, I made use of this exact tip. So to bridge the gap here, I turned the work around and then used a knitted cast on or a cable cast on, both work, to bridge this gap. And once you bridge the gap, you can turn your work around again and continue knitting in this direction. This trick is also very, very useful when you are knitting gloves and need to bridge the gap between the fingers, or for mittens here, for the thumb. In all of these cases, you can turn your work around and use a knitted or a cable cast on for an edge that is so much more stable. Okay, the fact that you can cast on additional stitches here on the right and on the left side of a project should be fairly common knowledge. But this wouldn't be a tutorial with advanced knitting tips if I couldn't add a little bit more. So did you know that you can also cast on in the middle of a project using stacked increases? So here's how. I want you to start with make one right. So make one right is if this leg here is leaning towards the right. Then slip one stitch and follow up with a make one left. This make one left might be a little bit more difficult to knit. And then slip back 2 stitches. And from here I want you to stack increases like this. So knit one, yarn over, and knit one more time into the same stitch. Then slip back 2 stitches, and from here on repeat. Knit one, yarn over, knit one, slip back 2, knit one, yarn over, knit one, slip back 2. And you can continue stacking increases in this manner for as long as you like. And once you are done, you simply continue knitting across your stack of increases. Go slowly. This first little round can be a bit fiddly. And then you simply continue knitting. So a couple of rows later, this will be the result. And now you might go, well, Norman, that's all nice and cute, but what is it for? Well, I want you to fold things over, and then you might recognize that this is a little baby booty in the making. So for example, 2 years ago or so, I came up with a pattern for these little gingerbread Christmas ornaments, and I've used stacked increases to knit these arms here in a seamless way. And now you might probably understand why I actually call this a mid-row cast-on, because it enables you to do exactly that. Cast on stitches here to continue in this direction in the middle of a row. So sometimes a pattern in the round comes with a section in reverse, a stockinette stitch, or just an awful lot of purl stitches, or even just complicated purl decreases or increases you want to avoid. Say as a continental knitter, there are a lot of purl 3 together through the back loop, and you know that's typically something you want to avoid. So in all of these cases, you can use short rows to turn your work around mid-round, and then you slip one stitch and pull the yarn here down. This will create a German short row double stitch, and then you are here on the inside or on the wrong side, and then you can just continue knitting here, and this will of course create knit stitches on the outside or right side or whatever you want to call it. Now, as you come across the double stitch here in the next round, if you were knitting short rows, typically you would turn your work around. Now, like when you're shaping the neckline or so, you would turn your work around and create another double stitch. We are not going to do that. Instead, we just knit this double stitch together and continue knitting on the wrong side. So we're not really doing short rows. We are just knitting basically one endlessly long short row here, and we're just using the short row double stitch to prevent a gap when we at the spot where we turned around. And just to make you understand why this makes sense, so personally I don't mind purling at all. It's just as easy as knit stitches. However, say you need to purl 3 together through the back loop. So the theory is that you enter these 3 stitches here from the behind and through the back loop. And you will quickly notice that it's almost impossible, even for me. However, here on this side, we can knit 3 together through the back loop. And that is very, very doable. So by turning around, we could turn an almost impossible stitch into something that's fairly easy. So you will continue this endlessly long short row until you feel, okay, now I've had enough, now I need to turn around, and then you do the exact same thing. You turn around and you create one more little short row stitch, and you will resolve this stitch in the next round and continue knitting across. Of course, now you can also invert things again, and here you can see the nice beautiful little purl section we created without actually purling across. So that's super nice. So here's how most patterns have you knitting stripes. So you join in a new color and then you knit across one row. And then you turn around and knit across the wrong side as well. And whenever you finish such a wrong side row, you can turn around. Both yarn tails here are on the same side, and then you could pick up the blue yarn again and where is my needle? Continue knitting across. However, I want you to challenge this habit. Well, sure enough, I mean, I can pick up this blue yarn here and knit across. That's what I can do. However, here, when I come to the end, I don't actually have to turn around. I'm knitting with circular needles, so I can slide my work here all the way back, pick up my orange yarn here again, find the other end of the needle, and then knit across. So I don't have to knit always just increments of 2. My stripes don't need to, even when I'm knitting flat, my stripes don't have to be 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 rows wide. They can only just be 1 row wide. Okay, using this simple trick, you can create any combination of stripes you want. Even if the tails don't even have to be on the same side, just slide things across to excess things. But if you thought this is where this trick stops, well, then you don't know me well enough. You can even combine it with short rows. So I'm going to slip the first 4 stitches here in my pattern, and then I just join in a new yarn and knit across. So most patterns that use short rows for decorative purposes will have you starting here on the edge, and that often results in a little trail that leads to your short rows, but you don't need that. So, and now I simply turn around, slip that stitch without splitting the yarn, of course. There you go, and create my short row stitch, and then I knit across. I'm doing garter stitch here, but you don't have to do that. And then here I turn around again, create my double stitch, and knit across, turn around, create a double stitch, knit across. And later on, when I finished my little block of color, I just slip all these stitches here over to my knitting needle and use the exact same trick. So I slide the stitches here back to this end of the needle, pick up my old color, and simply knit across. So this trick here even works in the middle of a project. Of course, if you come across any double stitches here, you will have to resolve them, but that should be easy enough. And see, using this simple little trick, you can create little blobs of color here in the middle of your fabric without having to knit intarsia. Just pay attention here at the very end of your color block as you knit across in the new color. Twist the yarns around once to avoid a visible gap. And nothing prevents you from doing this multiple times in a row. Just knit one color block, slip stitches here, knit another, slip stitches, and then later on knit across to create little blobs of color bubbles or bubbles in your fabric without intarsia. The very last thing I want you to challenge is the way you look at crochet. Often people think in black and white, yet I do believe that the true fun starts if you combine the two crafts. So it starts with little things. You can crochet a magic ring and then transfer your little slip stitch here back to a knitting needle and then pick up stitches here through those single crochets, and then add another double pointed knitting needle. Of course, this also works with circular knitting needles, and pick up stitches from all of these single crochets here along the edge. If you have problems with picking up stitches, you can of course also use your crochet hook, and then simply continue knitting across. You picked up all stitches and now the fun starts. You knit across. And what makes this technique so ingenious that later on, once you are finished with your project, you can simply pull on the tail of your magic ring and close things shut, and there you have a beautiful, almost invisible, nice and neat start of your project in the round. Perfect for, I don't know, heads top down or something like that. Now I have a full episode with Essential Crochet for Knitters. I'll link it to you up in here with many more very simple and basic tricks. Right here and now I want you to consider that you can easily transition from any crochet pattern to knitting. So I have some very basic shell stitches here, and now I'm going to pick up a knitting needle, and here along, I started it with single crochets, and here along this edge I just pick up these stitches one at a time with my knitting needle. Now it's important to note that you need to meet the gauge. So crochet and knitting work quite a little bit differently. So if you work with a 5mm hook, you can't expect to get the same results then compared to a 5mm needle. So you kind of have to toy around a little bit until you can meet your crochet gauge. And then pick up every little stitch here along this edge. Once those stitches are all back on your knitting needle, pick up a yarn in a nice contrasting color. I mean, it also could be the same color, and knit across. These stitches might be a little bit tight, and if you notice you split the yarn, you can of course fix that as well. And simply knit across. You can also do it the other way around, so you can start with knitting and then pick up stitches for crochet. Works as well, but right here and now I wanted you to see that you can also do it the other way around. I know there are quite a lot of people who crochet here on my channel, and maybe this will give you some nice ideas. So 2 rows later, this is the result. Isn't this beautiful? And I'm reasonably sure that you are aware that you can combine this technique with any other crochet border on this planet. And mind you, if you go to YouTube here and search for crochet borders, you probably will find 1,000 different ones. I mean, there's not just this shell stitch. There are so many others. And this can be a really fun way to start your project. Okay, we are back here in my studio. I'm still wearing my gorgeous new shawl and I'm just so in love with this color combination. Well, anyway, how did you like my advanced knitting tips and tricks? Did you know some of them? All of them? Or was everything new? Comment below with your thought, and please if you would like to add a tip, then do that as well. I always love scrolling through the comments, and I'm very sure a lot of you watching also do that, because you can always learn a little tip and trick in between these hundreds of comments. So do add your thoughts. Again, this video was tough to produce and took a lot of preparation, and I'm not just talking about the, I don't know, 40-50 swatches I had to knit. So if you like my work, consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll find the link in the description below, along with all other tutorials and techniques I briefly mentioned in this video. I know some of it was a little bit fast, but this video was after all intended for more experienced knitters. But if you are starting out, there are many great free resources on my blog. All of them come with slow motion videos, and of course there's also my second channel which only has slow motion videos. Anyway, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.